The throne room of the Caliph Empire was older than most civilizations. Its black marble walls stretched 100 meters high, carved with the names of every species that had knelt before the empire over the last 12,000 years. There were thousands of names. Some of those species no longer existed. Emperor Zorval sat on his throne, made of compressed starlight, and looked down at the war council gathered below him. His 4 eyes glowed a dull gold, and when he spoke, the room fell silent, the way a world falls silent before an earthquake. "The humans," Zorval said. "Tell me about the humans." High Commander Dreth stepped forward. He was the most decorated soldier in the Empire's history. He had burned cities on 40 worlds, and had never once lost a campaign. He activated the holographic display, and a small blue planet appeared floating in the air between them. Earth. It looked like something you could crush between 2 fingers. "A grade 7 species," Dreth said, his voice full of boredom. "They have colonized their own star system, but have not expanded beyond it. They possess basic energy weapons, primitive shielding technology, and a small fleet of roughly 2,000 ships. Their civilization is fractured. They fought a continental war among themselves only 60 years ago." He paused and let out a sound that was the Caliph version of a laugh. "They are not a threat. They are an errand." Zorval nodded slowly. The Caliph had done this many times before. A young species would rise, spread across its little corner of space, and then the Empire would arrive. Sometimes the species surrendered. Sometimes they fought. It never mattered. The result was always the same. "You will take 4,000 warships," Zorval said. 2 million ground soldiers. Bring them into the fold." Dreth bowed. It would be easy. It was always easy. But then a voice spoke from the far side of the room. Ambassador Lean stepped out of the shadows. She was thin and pale, even for a Caliph. She had spent her career studying lesser species, learning their languages, reading their histories. Most of the War Council considered her work pointless. "Why study something you are going to conquer?" "I would advise caution," Lean said quietly. The room shifted. Dreth turned to look at her with open contempt. "Caution? Against a grade 7 world?" "I have studied the humans for 30 years, Lean said. "They are strange. Every other species we have observed follows the same pattern. They evolve, they unify, they expand. The humans did not do this. They fight each other constantly, war after war after war, for thousands of years. They burn their own cities, they destroy their own people." She paused. "And yet they survive, every single time. I have never seen anything like it in any species in our records." Dreth waved his hand dismissively. "Internal conflict is a sign of weakness, not strength." "Or," Lean said, "it is practice." Nobody laughed. But nobody listened either. Zorval gave the order, and within 1 cycle, the Caliph invasion fleet departed for the Sol system. The war declaration arrived on Earth 3 days later. It was broadcast on every frequency, in every language, translated perfectly. The Caliph were thorough. The message was simple. Surrender your worlds, disarm your fleets, kneel before the Empire. You have 10 standard cycles to comply. Resistance will result in annihilation. For about 6 hours, there was panic. News networks ran the footage on loop. Politicians made speeches. People stared at the sky and wondered if this was the end. It was the reaction the Caliph expected. But deep beneath the mountains of what used to be called Korea, in a bunker that did not officially exist, the reaction was very different. General Han Do-hyun sat at the head of a long steel table in the war room of the United Earth Defense Force. He was 57 years old. His hair was gray. His face was calm, the way deep water is calm. Around him sat the people he trusted most in the world. Colonel Yoon Hana, head of the Special Tactics Division, sat to his left. She had not blinked once since the transmission played. Captain Bei Jinu, the youngest pilot to ever command a combat squadron, leaned back in his chair, with his arms crossed and a strange grin on his face. Dr. Kwon Mire, the lead scientist of a project so classified that even most generals did not know it existed, watched the data scroll across her screen with bright, hungry eyes. And Sergeant No Tae-sun, who had fought in the last great war on Earth and still carried shrapnel in his left leg, simply cracked his knuckles and waited. Do-hyun read the Caliph Declaration aloud. He read it slowly, carefully, like a man reading a menu at a restaurant. When he finished, he set the document down. The room was silent. Then he laughed. It was not a loud laugh. It was not a mocking laugh. It was the quiet laugh of a man who had been waiting for something for a very long time, and had just been told it was finally here. "Sir," Hana said. "Wake up Project Veil," Do-hyun said. "Tell the Ghost Wing to suit up, and get me a channel to every defense station in the system." He stood up. "We have been preparing for this for 80 years. It is time." The truth was something the Caliph never suspected. Humanity had known about them for 8 decades. A crashed Caliph probe had been found on the dark side of the moon in 2265. Then, another in the asteroid belt. Then a scout ship, damaged and drifting near Neptune. Each one had been recovered in secret. Each one had been taken apart, studied, and reverse-engineered by teams of scientists who worked their entire lives without ever being able to tell anyone what they did. And from those broken pieces of alien technology, humanity had built something new, something the Caliph had never seen before. Not because humans were smarter, not because they were more advanced, but because humans had one quality that no other species in the galaxy seemed to possess. When they saw something terrifying coming toward them, they did not run. They did not freeze. They started building. That evening, General Do-hyun stood before the United Earth Council. Every leader on the planet watched him on their screens. He did not give a long speech. He was not that kind of man. "They looked at us and saw a species that fights itself," Do-hyun said. "They should have asked the right question. What happens when we stop fighting each other and start fighting together?" The council voted unanimously for war, and somewhere in the black between stars, 4,000 Caliph warships moved toward a world that was not afraid. High Commander Dreth stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the Sol system grow larger on the display. It was a small, quiet little corner of the galaxy. One yellow star, a handful of rocky planets, some gas giants, nothing impressive. He had conquered systems 10 times this size without breaking formation. His fleet moved in the Iron Tide. It was the oldest and most feared battle formation in Caliph military history. 4,000 warships arranged in a massive wall, each one linked to the others through a shared communication network that allowed them to fight as one single organism. The Iron Tide had crushed 100 species. It was perfect. It was unbreakable. Dreth opened a channel and broadcast toward the inner system. "People of Earth, your time has ended. Surrender now, and your population will be spared for labor service. Resist, and you will be erased. You have 1 hour." There was no response. Dreth waited. The minutes passed. No signal, no message, not even static, just silence. He turned to his second officer. "They are too frightened to speak." Deep inside the dwarf planet Ceres, Colonel Yoon Hana sat in a command chair surrounded by dozens of screens. She watched the Caliph fleet pass Jupiter's orbit. She watched their formation. She studied the spacing between their ships, the rhythm of their movements, the way they communicated. She had been studying Caliph tactics for 20 years. She knew the Iron Tide better than most Caliph commanders did. "They are in the pocket," she said calmly. She pressed a single button on her console. "Initiate Protocol Sundown." The first thing the Caliph noticed was the light. As their fleet crossed the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, Thousands of small objects that had been floating silently among the rocks suddenly came alive. They were not bombs. Instead, they released massive electromagnetic pulses that tore through space like invisible storms. The pulses hit the Calith communication network like a hammer hitting glass. In an instant, the Iron Tide went blind. Ships that had been perfectly synchronized moments ago were now isolated. Captains called out to each other and heard nothing but screaming static. Navigation systems flickered and died. Sensor arrays showed ghosts and shadows that were not there. The wall of 4,000 warships began to drift apart like a school of fish that had just seen a shark. Dreth gripped the railing of his bridge. "What is happening? Restore communications immediately." His officers scrambled, but the pulses kept coming. Every time they cleared one frequency, another mine activated on a different wavelength. It was like trying to stop a flood with your hands. And then the Ghost Wing arrived. Captain Bei Jinu had been sitting inside a hollowed-out asteroid for 6 days. His fighter was small and fast and built for one purpose: to kill things much bigger than itself. Around him, 200 pilots just like him sat in their own asteroids, scattered across 1,000,000 kilometers of space, waiting for this exact moment. "Ghost Wing, this is Jinu," he said into his comm. "They are deaf and blind. Let us go say hello." 200 fighters launched from the rocks, like wasps from a nest. They were so small that even working Calith sensors would have had trouble seeing them. Against blinded sensors, they were invisible. Jinu led his squad straight into the fractured formation and began cutting it apart. They did not aim for hulls. They did not try to destroy ships. Instead, they targeted engines, communication dishes, and sensor arrays. Every strike was precise. Every pass was surgical. A Calith battlecruiser would suddenly lose its engines and drift helplessly. Another would lose its sensors and begin firing wildly at empty space. The formation did not just break. It dissolved into chaos. Dreth watched 300 of his ships go dark in the first hour. Not destroyed, disabled, crippled, turned into floating metal boxes full of confused soldiers. It was worse than destruction. Destroyed ships were gone. Crippled ships clogged the formation and sent out distress signals that nobody could answer. "Push forward," Dreth roared. "Ignore the losses. Make for the inner planets. We take Mars first." The remains of the fleet pushed inward. They were hurt and angry, and desperate to find something solid to hit. Mars appeared on their screens, and Dreth ordered the ground invasion. 40,000 Calith soldiers loaded into dropships and fell toward Mars Colony Alpha. It was one of humanity's largest off-world settlements. A city of 500,000 people. Or at least it had been. The dropships landed in empty streets. The soldiers moved through buildings that still had lights on and food on tables, but no people. Not a single human. The entire colony had been evacuated months before the Calith even entered the system. Sergeant No Taesun watched from 3 kilometers underground. He sat in a reinforced bunker with 500 soldiers and a detonation console. He could see the Calith troops on his screens, moving carefully through the abandoned colony, checking every building, every room. They were confused. They were looking for an enemy that was not there. Taesun waited until the maximum number of Calith soldiers were inside the colony grid. Then he looked at the young soldier sitting next to him, a private barely 20 years old, with shaking hands. "Steady," Taesun said. "This is what we trained for." He pressed the switch. The explosion was not one blast, but thousands of them, rippling across the entire colony in a wave. Every building, every street, every wall had been packed with charges during the evacuation. The colony tore itself apart in a storm of fire and dust. The Martian ground swallowed entire battalions. 40,000 Calith soldiers had walked into the largest trap ever built, and the red planet buried them. Above Mars, Dreth received the casualty report. He read the numbers. He read them again. His hands, which had never trembled in 40 years of war, began to shake. In less than one day, he had lost 300 ships and 40,000 ground troops, without ever facing a human fleet in open battle. Ambassador Lean stood in the corner of the bridge. She said nothing. She did not need to. The look on Dreth's face said everything. Dreth opened a secure channel to Emperor Zorval. The connection took a long time to establish. When Zorval's golden eyes appeared on the screen, Dreth forced himself to stand straight. "Report," Zorval said. "They were waiting for us," Dreth said. "Every step we have taken, they predicted. Every move we made, they had a counter ready. This is not a primitive species. They have been preparing for decades." He paused. "They are not what we expected." Zorval stared at him for a long moment. Then the connection ended without a word. In the silence that followed, Dreth turned to the viewport and looked out at the scattered remains of his fleet. Somewhere out there, in the dark between the planets, he knew the humans were watching, waiting, and he understood for the first time that this war was not going to be the errand he had promised his emperor. It was going to be something much worse. Emperor Zorval did not sleep for 3 days after Dreth's report. He sat alone in his war chamber and watched the battle recordings over and over. The electromagnetic mines, the ghost fighters, the empty colony that became a grave. He had seen 1,000 wars in his long life, and none of them looked like this. Every species the Caliph had ever fought followed the same pattern. They built the biggest fleet they could. They met the Caliph in open battle, and they lost. It was simple. It was predictable. The humans did not seem to know these rules, or worse, they knew the rules and had chosen to ignore them entirely. He gave the order. 6,000 additional warships. The second fleet would be led by Admiral Velk, a younger and more aggressive commander. Together with Dreth's remaining forces, they would outnumber the entire human fleet by more than 4-1. Zorval connected to the fleet via holographic link and took direct oversight of the campaign. There would be no more surprises. On Earth, General Han Do-hyun watched the intelligence reports with the same calm expression he always wore. The second fleet was enormous. If the Caliph reached Earth in full strength, no amount of clever tricks would save them. He gathered his inner circle in the war room beneath the mountains. Colonel Yoon Hana, Captain Bae Jinu, whose left arm was in a sling from a close call during the first battle. Dr. Kwon Mireille, who had not slept in days and did not seem to care. And Sergeant No Taeson, who sat quietly in the corner, cleaning his rifle like a man with nowhere else to be. "They are sending everything," Do-hyun said. "We hurt them, and now they are angry. Angry enemies are dangerous, but they are also predictable." He pulled up the system map. "We are going to drag this out. We are going to make this war long and painful and expensive. We are going to make them bleed for every kilometer of space between here and Earth. This is what we do best. This is Operation Long Night." Then he turned to Dr. Kwon Mireille. "Show them." Mireille stood up and activated the display. She had spent 25 years inside Project Veil. She had built things that most people on Earth would not believe were real. And now, for the first time, she was allowed to use them. 3 weapons, she said. First, the Null Lances, directed energy cannons that operate on a frequency the Caliph do not know exists. Their shields are designed to block every known form of energy attack. The Null Lances go through those shields like they are not there. She changed the display. Second, Echo Drones, unmanned ships controlled by artificial intelligence. Each one mimics the exact signal profile of a real human warship. For every real ship we send, we can create 10 ghosts that look identical on sensors. The Caliph will not be able to tell which targets are real. She changed the display again. Third, the Shroud Network, a web of micro-satellites that bends light around our ships. We can make entire battle groups invisible. Jinnu let out a low whistle. You have been busy. Mireille did not smile. We have been terrified. Terror makes you creative. The Caliph reinforcement fleet arrived in the Sol system 2 weeks later. Admiral Velk was confident. 10,000 warships, combined with Drek's surviving forces. The largest fleet ever assembled against a single species. They pushed inward in a wide formation, determined not to be caught in the same trap twice. It did not matter. The first thing Velk noticed was that the human fleet had grown. His sensors showed thousands of ships spread across the inner system. He was confused. Intelligence said the humans had only 2,000 vessels. Now there were 10 times that number. He ordered a full scan. The results came back the same. Human signatures everywhere. He did not know that 9 out of every 10 contacts on his screen were echo drones. Empty machines pretending to be warships. The real human fleet was invisible, wrapped in the Shroud network, watching and waiting. Velk ordered an attack on the largest cluster of human ships near the asteroid belt. 3,000 Caliph warships opened fire on targets that did not exist. The drones absorbed the first volley and then scattered, drawing the Caliph ships out of formation. And from the darkness behind them, the real human fleet appeared and fired the null lances. The Caliph had never seen weapons like these. Their shields, which could stop plasma bursts and kinetic rounds, did nothing. The null lances cut through them like light through glass. Ships that thought they were protected exploded from the inside. In the first exchange, 400 Caliph warships were destroyed in minutes. Drath, commanding from the other side of the formation, tried to regroup. But the humans were already gone, vanished back into the Shroud, leaving nothing but wreckage and ghosts. Meanwhile, at Saturn's moon Titan, the Caliph attempted to establish a forward base. They landed 50,000 troops and began building fortifications. Sergeant No Tae-sun was waiting for them. He had arrived weeks earlier with 3,000 soldiers and enough supplies to last a year. They had dug into the frozen ground like animals, tunnels that went kilometers deep, hidden positions under ice sheets, weapon caches buried in craters. Tae-sun had studied guerrilla warfare his entire life. He knew that a small force in the right position could hold off an army if it was willing to be patient and ruthless. The Caliph built their base. Tae-sun let them. He waited until they felt safe. Then, in the middle of their sleep cycle, his people attacked from every direction at once. They hit supply depots, communication towers, and landing pads. They struck and vanished before the Caliph could respond. And then they did it again and again, every night, every cycle, without stopping. Tae-sun added one more element. He hacked into the Caliph communication frequency and began broadcasting their own casualty numbers back to them, on a loop. The numbers grew every day. The Caliph soldiers on Titan began to break. They stopped sleeping. They fired at shadows. They begged for evacuation. In orbit, Captain Bei Jinnu fought his own war. During a battle near Saturn's rings, a Caliph carrier exploded and filled the space around it with a massive field of spinning debris. Any sane pilot would have pulled away. Jinnu flew his Ghostwing squadron directly into the wreckage, using the broken metal as cover. They weaved between the shattered hull pieces at speeds that should have killed them, and came out behind the Caliph flagship. Jinnu personally disabled its main cannon with 3 precise shots, before the flagship even knew he was there. The Caliph began to whisper a new word among themselves. They called the humans the ones who do not stop. It was not a name of respect. It was a name of fear. In 12,000 years of empire, the Caliph had never been afraid of the species they conquered. They were afraid now. Ambassador Lian requested an audience with Zorval. She found him staring at the war map, watching his fleet lose ships in real time. Every species we have conquered accepted their fate, Lian said quietly. The humans do not seem to have that instinct. Zorval did not respond for a long time. Then he gave an order that made even Dreth go pale. He authorized the use of the World Breaker Array, a weapon that could tear a planet apart from the inside. It had been used only twice in the Empire's history. Both times, the target species had been erased completely. He ordered it aimed at Earth. When the intelligence reached General Dohyun, he was drinking tea in the war room. He read the report. He set down his cup. He looked at Yoon Hana, who was already pulling up star charts. "Then we go to them," he said. Nobody in the galaxy had ever attacked the Caliph Empire in its own space. In 12,000 years, not a single species had even tried. The idea was like punching the sun. You could want to do it. You could dream about doing it. But you would burn before your fist ever landed. That was what every species believed. Humanity had never been good at believing what it was told. General Han Do-hyun stood in front of 800 warship captains in a briefing room aboard the UEDF carrier Indomitable. They were about to do something that had no precedent in galactic history. They were about to jump out of their own star system and attack a Caliph military stronghold. "The target is Verath Prime," Do-hyun said, pointing at the star chart behind him. "It is a forward staging world where the World Breaker Array is being assembled. If that weapon becomes operational, Earth dies. So we are going to destroy it before that happens." He looked out at the faces in front of him. Some were scared. Some were excited. Some were both. 40 years ago, Dr. Kwan Mireille and her team cracked the Caliph faster than light drive. We have been building our own version in secret ever since. Today we use it. Operation Iron Dawn begins in 6 hours. 6 hours later, 800 human warships activated their experimental FTL drives and vanished from the Sol system. Across the Orion Arm, the effect was immediate. The Caliph had monitoring stations on 1,000 worlds, and every single one of them detected the energy signature of the human jump. But it was the other species that reacted most strongly. The Arali, a peaceful race that the Caliph had conquered 3,000 years ago, watched the data from their hidden listening posts and could not believe what they were seeing. The Fenshi, an insectoid species enslaved to work in Caliph mines, intercepted the same readings. The Dulkari, who had been planning a rebellion for centuries but never had the courage to start one, stared at their screens and felt something they had not felt in generations: hope. The human fleet arrived at Verath Prime in a storm of light. Colonel Yoon Hana commanded from the bridge of the UEDF Resolve. She had planned this assault for months, and she executed it the way she did everything, with cold and perfect precision. The fleet did not arrive at a single point. Instead, the 800 ships jumped in from 12 different directions simultaneously, appearing around Verath Prime like a net closing around a fish. The Caliph garrison at Verath Prime had 1,200 warships and heavy orbital defense platforms protecting the World Breaker Array. They outnumbered the human fleet, but Hana did not need to outnumber them. And 1,200 ships trying to respond to attacks from 12 directions at once was exactly the kind of chaos she loved. "All groups, engage," Hana said. Her voice was flat and calm, like a woman reading a weather report. Space around Verath Prime turned into a fire. Human and Caliph ships clashed at close range. The Null Lances tore through Caliph shields. The Echo drones created phantom fleets that split the garrison's attention. The Shroud Network hid Hana's heavy cruisers until they were close enough to fire directly into the Caliph formation's center. High above the battle, Captain Bei Jinu led the bomber wing toward the World Breaker Array itself. The array was massive, a structure the size of a small moon, bristling with energy collectors and ringed by defense platforms. Getting close to it was supposed to be impossible. Jinu had been told this several times during the briefing. He had smiled each time. His squadron punched through the first ring of defense platforms by flying in the sensor shadow of a Caliph cruiser that Hana's fleet had crippled. They used the dying ship as a shield, riding its wreckage until they were past the outer defenses. Then they scattered and dove toward the array at full speed. Jinnu lost half his pilots in the next 3 minutes. The defense platforms were fast and accurate, and there was no cover in open space. He watched good people die on his screens. He kept flying. There was no other option. Below, on the surface of Verith Prime, Sergeant No Taesun fell from the sky in a drop pod with 500 soldiers. Their mission was to destroy the array's ground-based power core. Without power, the world breaker was just metal. Taesun's team hit the ground hard and moved fast. They fought through Caliph security forces in the streets of a military city, clearing buildings and pushing toward the power facility. And as they moved deeper into the city, they found something none of them expected. There were cages, hundreds of them. Inside were members of the Fenshi, the Orali, and other species Taesun had only read about in intelligence files. They were thin and broken and covered in scars. They were slave laborers. The Caliph had used them to build the very weapon that would destroy Earth. Taesun stopped in front of one of the cages. An old Fenshi, barely alive, pressed against the bars and looked up at him with compound eyes full of confusion. "Who are you?" the Fenshi asked. Taesun broke the lock off the cage. "Back up," he said. His soldiers opened every cage they found, and the freed prisoners, hundreds of them, did not run. They picked up fallen Caliph weapons, and then they followed them toward the power core. News of the liberation spread through Verith Prime's slave population like fire through dry grass. Within hours, Fenshi, Orali, and Dulcari workers across the planet were rising up. They sabotaged factories, they blocked roads, they overwhelmed their guards with sheer numbers. The Caliph garrison, already fighting the human fleet in orbit, now had a rebellion on the ground. Above the planet, Jinnu reached the World Breaker Array. He was down to 40 pilots out of the 120 he started with. The array's charging chamber was deep inside the structure, protected by layers of armor. There was no clean shot from the outside. Jinnu made a decision that would later be described by Caliph military historians as either the bravest or the most insane act of war they had ever recorded. He flew his fighter directly into the array, through a maintenance port barely wider than his ship, down a corridor meant for service drones, into the charging chamber itself. He fired everything he had, every missile, every round. He emptied his entire weapons load into the heart of the World Breaker Array. Then he yanked his ejection handle and blew out of his disintegrating fighter as the chamber around him turned white with light. The World Breaker Array exploded from the inside. The blast was visible from orbit. The defense platforms lost power. The Caliph fleet, already losing the battle in space and the battle on the ground, began to fall apart. Hana's ships pulled Jinnu's escape pod from the wreckage 18 minutes later. He was alive, barely. Both legs were broken. He was bleeding from his ears, but he was smiling. On his throne world, Emperor Zorval watched Verith Prime fall. His golden eyes were wide. High Commander Dreth stood beside him, humiliated, his career in ruins. "They crossed the void," Zorval whispered. "They came to our space. They destroyed our weapon. They freed our slaves." He turned to Dreth. "What kind of species does this?" Before Dreth could answer, a transmission cut through every communication channel in the Orion Arm. It was broadcast in the Caliph common language, clear and strong, and every species with a receiver heard it at the same time. General Han Do-hyun's voice filled the stars. "We did not start this war, but we will finish it. Not just for Earth, for every world you have put in chains." Across 1,000 conquered planets, People who had been slaves for centuries heard those words and began to believe that maybe for the first time, freedom was not just a dream. Do Hyun's message broke the galaxy open like a hammer breaking glass. On the mining world of Dulkar, where the Dulkari people had been digging ore for the Caliph for 900 years, workers put down their tools and picked up metal rods. On the ocean planet of Fenera, Fenshi laborers overwhelmed the Caliph garrison in a single night and took control of the planet's communication towers. On Orali Prime, a species known for their pacifism built barricades for the first time in their history and refused to let Caliph soldiers pass. It happened on dozens of worlds, then hundreds. The Caliph Empire had been held together by fear for 12,000 years. But fear only works when the people being afraid believe they have no other choice. Do Hyun's broadcast and the fall of Verith Prime showed them that there was another choice. A species from a single star system had looked the Caliph in the eye and refused to kneel. And now, everyone else was refusing too. Supply lines collapsed. Garrisons were overwhelmed. Messages from Caliph commanders poured into the throne world, each one more desperate than the last. The empire that had taken thousands of years to build was crumbling in weeks. Emperor Zorval made his final decision. He pulled every warship the empire had left, every reserve fleet, every planetary defense group, every training vessel, 30,000 warships, the largest armada in galactic history, and he sent them all toward Earth. His logic was simple. The rebellions were inspired by the humans. If Earth fell, the symbol would be destroyed, and the conquered species would lose hope and kneel again. It was the logic of an empire that had never understood its enemies. General Do Hyun knew the armada was coming. He had expected it. He stood in the command center of the UEDF orbital fortress above Earth and looked out at the planet below. Blue oceans, green land, clouds moving slowly across the surface. 8 billion people down there, every one of them depending on what happened in the next few hours. Colonel Yoon Hana arrived with the fleet disposition. The entire human navy, reinforced by ships built during the war, totaled just under 5,000 vessels. They were outnumbered 6-1. Thoughts? Do Hyun asked. We have been outnumbered since the beginning, Hana said. It has not stopped us yet. Captain Bae Jinu was in the medical bay when the alert sounded. He had been recovering from his injuries for 3 weeks. His legs were held together with metal pins. The doctors had told him he would not fly for months. He got out of the bed, put on his flight suit, and walked to the hangar. The medical officer tried to stop him. Jinu looked at her and said, "If we lose today, there is no months from now." She let him go. His squadron had been rebuilt. The other half were volunteers from the Fenshi, Orali, and Dulkari who had escaped their worlds and come to fight alongside the species that had freed them. Jinu looked at his mixed squadron and felt something he could not quite name. Pride, maybe. Or maybe just gratitude that he would not have to do this alone. Dr. Kwon Mireille was in the deepest level of the fortress, running final checks on Project Veil's last weapon. She called it the Hammer, a network of kinetic accelerators hidden inside the moon itself, capable of firing tungsten rods at a fraction of the speed of light. Each rod weighed 2 tons. At that speed, a single one carried more energy than a nuclear weapon, and there were thousands of them. The Caliph Armada arrived at the edge of the Sol system, like a dark cloud covering the sun. 30,000 ships. The sheer mass of them distorted the local gravity field. Dreth commanded the vanguard. He had been given one final chance to redeem himself, and he intended to take it or die. The Battle of Earth began. Hana's fleet met the Armada at the orbit of Mars. She had arranged her ships in a layered defense, each line designed to slow the Caliph advance and bleed them before they reached Earth. The first clash was brutal. Ships exploded on both sides. The null lances cut through Caliph's shields, but the sheer volume of enemy fire was staggering. Human ships burned and broke apart. The line held, then buckled, then held again. Sergeant No Taysun led a Marine boarding team onto a Caliph dreadnought that had pushed through the first defensive line. His team breached the hull through an airlock, fought through corridors filled with Caliph soldiers twice their size, and reached the bridge. Taysun personally took the captain's chair and turned the dreadnought's guns on its own fleet before the Caliph could retake the ship. The human fleet was being pushed back. They were losing ships faster than the Caliph, and the math was running out. Hana looked at the tactical display and saw the wall of red contacts pressing closer and closer to Earth. She opened a channel to Dahun. "General, we cannot hold them with ships alone." Dahun nodded. He opened a channel to the moon. "Dr. Kwan, fire the hammer." Mireille pressed the activation sequence. Deep inside the moon, 2,000 accelerator tubes pointed toward the approaching armada and fired. The tungsten rods crossed the distance between the moon and the Caliph formation in seconds. They were too small and too fast for any sensor to track. Each one hit a Caliph warship with the force of a small star being born. The rods did not just penetrate shields and armor. They passed through ships entirely, entering one side and exiting the other, leaving nothing but superheated wreckage behind. Some rods hit multiple ships in a line. In a single volley, 800 Caliph warships ceased to exist. The second volley killed 600 more. The third volley broke the formation completely. Ships that had been flying in tight attack patterns scattered in every direction as their commanders realized that something was hitting them that they could not see, could not block, and could not survive. And then, from the edges of the system, new contacts appeared. Hana saw them on her display first. Hundreds of ships jumping into the Sol system from FTL. They were not human. They were Orali cruisers, repurposed mining ships armed with plasma cutters. Fenshi swarm carriers, each one holding thousands of small fighter drones. Dulkari heavy frigates, slow and ugly and bristling with stolen Caliph weapons. No one had called them. No one had asked for help. They had come because they chose to. The Caliph armada was surrounded. High Commander Dreth saw the battle turn and knew it was over. But he refused to accept it. He ordered his flagship to full speed and aimed it directly at Earth. If he could not win the battle, he would destroy the planet. He would turn this defeat into ashes that tasted like victory. Bei Jinu saw the flagship accelerate. He understood what was happening immediately. He pushed his fighter to maximum speed and intercepted the massive ship alone. He flew along the surface of the hull, meters above the metal skin, firing at engine housings and power conduits. The flagship was 1,000 times his size. He looked like an insect attacking a building. But insects, as it turned out, could sting. He hit the primary fuel line. The flagship's engines stuttered, then failed. The enormous ship drifted, powerless, past Earth's orbit and into the grip of the planet's defense stations, which tore it apart. Dreth was pulled from the wreckage alive. He was brought before Dohyun in restraints. As they walked through the corridors of the orbital fortress, Dreth looked at the old general and asked the question that had been burning in him since the first day. How? You had one system. We had thousands. Dohyun walked beside him and did not slow down. You built your empire by making others kneel. We built ours by standing up every time we were knocked down. That is the difference. On the Caliph throne world, Emperor Zorval stood at the window of his war chamber and watched rebel fleets fill his sky. His empire was gone. His armada was destroyed. His people were surrounded. Ambassador Lean stood beside him, as she always had, patient and quiet. You warned me, Zorval said. What did you see in them that I did not? Lean thought for a moment. They are afraid of everything, she said. Death, pain, loss, the dark. But they fight anyway. That is what makes them terrifying. Zorval closed his 4 eyes and signed the Galactic Accord of Surrender. The Caliph Empire, 12,000 years old, dissolved with the stroke of a pen. 1 year later, a ceremony was held on a neutral space station at the center of the Orion Arm. Representatives from every freed species gathered alongside human diplomats. The Galactic Free Alliance was born that day, not as an empire, not as a hierarchy, but as a promise that no species would ever kneel again. General Han Do-hyun gave a short speech. He looked older now, tired, but his eyes were still steady. "We did not win because we were the strongest," he said. "We won because we refused to accept a universe built on chains." On the other side of the station, Captain Bae Jinu sat in a training hangar, teaching a class of young pilots. Half were human, half were Fenshi and Arali and Dolkari, their strange hands and claws wrapped around flight controls designed for fingers very different from theirs. They were learning, they were laughing, they were terrible at it, and they did not care. A young Fenshi student raised a thin arm. "Captain Bae, were you scared during the war?" Jinu leaned back in his chair and grinned. "Every single second. That is what kept me alive." The galaxy had seen conquerors before, ancient and powerful and certain of their supremacy. But they had never seen anything like humanity, a species born in struggle, forged in chaos, and utterly, maddeningly unwilling to die quietly. The Caliph had looked at Earth and seen a small world full of small creatures fighting over small things. They should have looked closer. They should have seen what that fighting really meant. It meant that when the real enemy finally came, humanity was already ready, because they had been training for it their entire history. Every war, every loss, every time they fell down and got back up, it was all practice, and the galaxy would never forget the lesson.